Hello and welcome. In this video, I'm creating some die cut flowers and using 6 different techniques. I'll be using the Concord and 9th Paper Posy Bundle, which features a stamp set, an embossing folder, and some dies. I won't be using the stamp set today, but I will be using the embossing folder and the die set to create 6 different flowers. So here's the sentiment stamp set that coordinates with this. And I will be creating these large flowers that sort of feature 2 sets of the bigger petals and then 2 sets of the small petals. In my first example, I'm going to be doing a simple die cut flower. So I've cut out the various petals out of 3 different shades of yellow cardstock, and now I'm adhering them together with some liquid adhesive, just applying that to the centers and then sticking the flower petal layer down. I'm also going to use some foam tape, which I will cut in these small squares in half to make sure they're small enough and won't be visible, and just to add some dimension. So I'm adding that behind the sort of medium yellow color, which will give it a little bit of lift in the center of the flower, and then using some liquid adhesive to adhere the brown center to it. I'll be doing the exact same adhering method for the rest of my flowers, so I'm not going to show it again, but this is what I did for all of the flowers. I'm next adding some foam adhesive squares that I've cut in half to make them a little bit smaller, and I'm tucking them behind each of the various petals to sort of give them a little bit of lift and create some dimensions, and so that they don't look so flat. So I kind of randomly add the adhesive, and I'm doing it under both the larger petals and then the smaller sort of center petals, just trying to create some depth to these flower blooms that I'm creating. And that is our first example. In our second example, I'm embossing the die cut pieces using that embossing folder. So the first step is to cut out all of the petal pieces and then lay them into the embossing folder. So you have the lines on the embossing folder to sort of give you a sense of where the petals go, and then you can use the inside of the embossing folder, which you can't really see in the image of the video, but basically just line them up in the embossing folder. And you can do multiple petals at once, depending on what kind of flower you're doing, as well as leaves. So once those are in there and in the right place, I'm going to close the embossing folder and run that through my embossing machine. So once that's done, we'll sort of take them out of the embossing folder, and you can sort of use either the embossed side or the debossed side, depending on what most interests you. This would be the final flower after it's been adhered together. In the next example, I'm going to be creating an inked die cut flower. So I have my die cut petal pieces cut out of various colors of cardstock, and I'm going to add them to my sticky mat so I can add some ink to them. I'll be using a slightly darker shade for each of the layers. So on my lilac cardstock, I'm going to be using lilac ink and just sort of ink blending in the center. Because there's a lot of overlap with these flower petals, the key is making sure there's enough ink visible while not being completely covering the entire petal. So it can be a little bit tricky. And in this case, for these pink ones, I messed up, so I had to recut petals, and I'm now trying to ink them in a little bit better way. But you can use sort of, overlay them to see like how much of the inking is visible, because again, you want to make sure that some ink is visible, but it's not basically covering the whole petal, so you have some sort of depth and dimension to it. In this case, I used just the same shade of cardstock to ink ratio, but if you're concerned, you could always use a darker shade just to make sure it's a little bit more clear and visible. Again, just adding sort of that ink blending to the centers of all the petals. I'll then adhere the pieces together, and that will sort of create our inked die cut flower. In our next example, we're going to ink the edges of the die cut. So it's still an inking technique, but slightly different than the previous example. So in this case, I'm actually going to be using a shade darker just to make sure it's a little bit more dramatic. And I'm going to be taking my ink blending brush, dapping it into my ink, and then tapping some excess off, and then starting at the edge of the flower and then dragging it towards the center. So just those ink tips are visible. I first learned this technique from JC Gaspar, so I encourage you to check out some of his videos as well. But basically just trying to pull that ink towards the center. It is not quite as obvious as I would like it to be in this video, but I'll have another example that makes it a lot more clear, this technique. So I'm using nectar cardstock in this for the larger petals, and then grapefruit ink, so it is a slightly darker shade of ink, so really make that dramatic pop. And the key here is to sort of be right on the edge and drag down towards the center. It helps to sort of find those little crevices. There aren't very many in these particular petals, but wherever there's sort of like an indentation in the petal. So in this example, I have grapefruit cardstock and I believe watermelon ink. So again, a slightly darker shade, and finding those indentations in the petals and tapping off any excess ink, and then just sort of pulling it down towards the center of the flower. This is very messy, like my fingers get really inked up. So if you don't love that, then maybe this isn't really the technique for you. But I love the way it looks at the end. Just adding the last bit of ink to my last flower, dragging it towards the center, trying to make it obvious but not so obvious that it's, you know, overpowering. Just like a nice little tipped ink edge. And then once that's done, I'll go ahead and glue all of the pieces together in the same way that I did before. In my next example, we're going to ink the embossing folder for our die cuts. So I have all of my die cut pieces. We're doing shades of orange this time. And I have 2 shades of cardstock. Again, I'm going to a shade darker. So for my spiced cider cardstock, I have the cayenne ink. And for my clementine cardstock, I have the spiced cider ink, so slightly different. I'm using a brayer to apply ink to the raised portions of the petals. So I'll roll the brayer into the ink, then roll it over the raised portion of the embossing folder. So that clear side of the embossing folder has the indentations that are raised, and then the side that has the black lines, the indentations are sort of lower. So you can just roll it right over and sort of catch those lines with the ink. I'm then going to lay my die cut images over these, and I like to flip them over so that it's sort of the nice side down of the die cut is, you know, on that side that is going to catch the ink, because you know you have that little bit of raise at the edges of your die cut, and that sort of the, you know, create the sort of nice side or, you know, not nice side. I'll close my embossing folder and run that through my embossing machine. And I also picked up this technique from Jennifer McGuire, so I definitely encourage you to check out her videos as well. And so once it comes out of the embossing folder, you'll sort of see the ink has kind of been trapped in those indentations. And it did get a little messy because like I shifted my die cuts around, but I think it's kind of cool with how that turns out in the end. And then in my last example, I'm using all the techniques, all of the inking techniques combined. So for these pieces, I am applying the ink directly into the center, much like the purple flower. In this one, I'm dragging the ink, and as you can tell, it's a lot more dramatic in this one than it was in the last one. A little bit juicier, and I'm actually using an ink pad that is 2 shades darker. So this is Aqua Sky cardstock and Peacock ink, so it's a really dramatic edge. And I went ahead and add some in the center too, although you won't see them once that's layered. So this matches our technique for sort of peach flower. And then I'm using Peacock ink again and lakefront cardstock to create those inked die cut images. And then I'll put those in my embossing folder and then take them out. And I just think it's really dramatic. And that is the finished flower combining all 3 of the inking techniques. So these are our final flowers, just a recap. So we have our basic die cut image and our yellow flower. Then we have our basic die cut image using the embossing details from the embossing folder. Then we did some inking techniques, so this just applies ink directly to the centers of the flowers. In this one, we added ink to the tips, sort of dragging it towards the center, just sort of create a dramatic effect. In this example, we inked the embossing folder and ran that through our die cutting machine. And in this last one, we created one flower featuring a lot of the techniques that we had just seen. Let me know which one is your favorite, and thanks for watching. If you like this video, please take a look at some of my other videos.